Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, brothers and sisters and friends. Can we have objective morals without God? Brothers and sisters, if objective morals exist, God must exist. If God doesn't exist, then objective morals do not exist. Let me begin this journey with a little story. Imagine you come home from work, from school, from college, from the gym, and you sit down on your sofa and you turn on the television and you're flicking through the channels, and all of a sudden you see this horrible, terrifying headline. Man beheads 7-year-old. You gasp. Man beheads 7-year-old. You're crying, you're in anguish, you just don't believe what's just happened. Let me ask you, this person in the story, a question. Is what the man did immoral? Yes, you say. I agree. I agree. Let me ask you another question. Is what he did objectively immoral? Is it objectively morally wrong? Is it? You'd be like, yes, of course. However, what do you mean by objective? What do we mean by objective in this context? In moral philosophy, specifically metaethics or moral ontology, when we talk about the objectivity of moral values or moral truths, we are saying that they are mind independent. They are mind independent. I would even say mind and feeling independent. They are outside of the limited human mind and limited human emotions. They are outside of the limited human mind and limited human emotions. This is what we mean by objectivity. Why am I saying this? Because if everyone that you know, if the whole world came together and said, it is morally good to behead a 7-year-old, you know it's still wrong. This is what we mean by objectivity. It's mind and feelings independent. So if moral values, moral truths are mind and feelings independent, how do we explain them? What explains their objective nature, and where did they come from? These are questions in moral philosophy, in moral ontology, in metaethics. What explains this moral truth to be objective, in this case, is outside of the limited human mind and limited emotions, and where did it come from? These are questions referring to moral ontology. So, if morals are objective in this way, even one moral, it doesn't have to be all morals, just one moral, to be objective in this way, God must exist. There's nothing else that answers these ontological questions. These questions in metaethics. These questions in the field of moral ontology. There is nothing else. Because God's commands answers these questions. For example, how is this moral mind independent, feeling independent? Well, it's very simple. It's based on God's commands. Because God's command is outside of the limited human mind and limited human emotions. God is transcendent. He could make the universal moral claim. God has the totality of wisdom and knowledge, including moral knowledge. God is actually the source of morality because He is Al-Bar. He is the source of all goodness. And God is objective, not subjective. He has no limitations. For something to be subjective, it's subject to a limitation. But something being subject to God's commands is not subjective because He is objective by definition. So, it explains how this moral is mind and feeling independent. And what is the source of this moral? Again, God's commands. And God's commands are a derivative of His will. And His will does not contradict His nature. And what is the nature of the divine? Ar-Rahman, the intensely merciful. Al-Wujud, the intensely loving, the loving. Ar-Rahim, the specially merciful. Al-Bar, the source of all goodness. Al-Hakim, the wise. Al-Alim, the knowing. And His commands are in line with this nature. This is why, if there are objective morals, even one, then God must exist. Because God's commands are the only way of explaining the objectivity of morals, that they're mind independent, feeling independent, and it explains where they came from. Now you may argue, Hamza, you're wrong. We have alternatives. Really? Like what? You may argue biology, natural selection, the Darwinian experiment, right? The Darwinian evolution. Darwinism explains objective morals. No, it doesn't. It may explain our ability to formulate ethical rules, because natural selection can explain our ability to formulate ethical rules, but it doesn't explain the objectivity of morals, that they're mind independent, feeling independent. It doesn't explain where they came from this point of view. And if you refer to biology or the Darwinian mechanism or Darwinian evolution as an explanation for objective morals, the morals are no longer objective. Why? Because the Darwinian mechanism tells us that we evolved as a result of biological conditions. This removes any meaning to any objective morals that we may believe in. Why? Because if we were reared under precisely the same conditions as, for example, the nurse shark, if you go to National Geographic, you see that the nurse shark bites the fin of its mate and wrestles its mate before it engages in the act, right? If we were reared under precisely the same conditions as the nurse shark, then we would think it's okay to rape women. Even Darwin echoed some of these sentiments. He basically said, well, if we were reared under precisely the same conditions as the bees, the hive bees, we would think it's okay to kill our fertile daughters. And no one would think of interfering. So are you saying objective morals are explained by just this kind of, these biological conditions? These reactions to biological conditions? No, because it loses any moral value, any moral meaning. Also, it's not objective anymore. It's subject to biological conditions. It's subject to biological conditions. So from this point of view, biology or the Darwinian mechanism doesn't explain the mind-independent, the feeling-independent nature of objective morals. So it's not an explanation for objective morality. The second point, you may argue, okay, well, we have another alternative, and the alternative is social pressure. Societies come together and they agree together. Well, this doesn't make sense, because the way we define objective morals is that it's mind independent. But it's not mind independent if you refer to social pressure, because it's individual minds coming together to make a moral conclusion. That doesn't sound like it's objective to me. Now you may think, oh yes, but when they come together, something else happens, right? And it makes it objective in that way. It's independent of one mind. Well, really? Because what if the whole world came together and decided that it was okay to actually behead a 7-year-old? Would you think it's okay by virtue of social pressure or societies coming together, people come together to agree on a certain moral claim? Of course you wouldn't. And in actual fact, in history, something similar happened, if not worse. You had a quasi-consensus, human beings coming together in Nazi Germany, and they said it was okay to annihilate and discriminate against Jews. By virtue of your alternative, you should think that discriminating against Jews is objectively morally true. But you would never say such a thing. I would never say such a thing. This is objectively immoral to discriminate against anyone. So, social pressure doesn't work, especially when you understand the nature of societies and how they change over time based on the development of the social norm and social influence on all of these things that happen in social psychology. So that's not a basis for objective moral truths. Doesn't explain the mind independent, the feeling independent nature of objective moral values and objective moral truths. Now you may say, okay, well, there's another alternative. Okay, what's that alternative? That alternative is moral realism. Now, I don't want to get into the crazy, massive, deep philosophical discussion on this topic, but let me just give you some points. Moral realism basically says that morals are objective and that's it. They don't require any grounding. You don't have to explain the mind-independent nature of moral truths. You don't have to explain the feeling-independent nature of moral truths. You don't even have to explain their source. I think that's a bit of a cop-out. Because what does it mean to say justice exists? Compassion exists in that way. It doesn't require any explanation. Well, how is that objective? How is it that it's mind-independent, feeling-independent? How is it that it's objective in that way? We need to explain its source. These are questions in moral ontology, in meta-ethics. We can't just ignore them just because we want to believe in objective moral truths. What does it mean just to say that compassion just exists in an objective way? It requires some kind of grounding. And that's why we're raising these questions in the first place. The other thing to investigate is this. When we talk about moral values and moral truths, we're talking about moral duties. These are owed. We have a duty to be moral. We have a duty to be just. We have a duty to be compassionate. We have a duty to be fair. We have a duty not to discriminate. We have a duty to be kind. We have a duty to be moral. But duties are owed. To whom? In moral realism, they're owed to nobody. And that's why the sense of moral duty doesn't even make sense under moral realism, and therefore morals don't make sense under moral realism, because you have these moral duties, but you don't owe them to anyone from that point of view in an objective way. You may say, oh, I owe it to him or I owe it to myself, but that's again not mind independent. So explore that in order for you to understand that moral realism is not an alternative to explain the existence of objective moral truths. So these are the main alternatives, and they fail. The only one, the only explanation that explains the mind and feeling independent nature of objective moral truths and explains where they came from are the commands of God, as we explained in the beginning. And that's why if objective moral truths exist, God exists. And if God doesn't exist, therefore objective moral truths don't exist. Now you may argue, you know what, fine, I don't believe in objective morals anymore. I don't even believe in one objective moral truth. Fine, go for it. I don't have a problem. This is a double-edged sword. It's a double-edged sword. On one hand, if you believed in at least one objective moral truth, you have to believe in God's existence because God's commands explains the objectivity of moral values and truths. But now you're moving away saying there are no objective moral values, not even one, then you're still in a sticky wicket. You're still in a problem. What's this problem? You can't point the finger against religion anymore in an objective way. It just becomes subject to your own perspective. For example, you can't point the finger at KKK and say that they are objectively morally wrong. You can't point the finger at ISIS or Daesh and say they are objectively morally wrong. You can't point the finger at Nazi Germany and say that the Nazis are objectively morally wrong. And that is a huge problem. And that renders all of your moral claims and judgments as weak and without any strong basis. Do you want to go down that route? Intuitively, it doesn't make sense. Now, obviously, there are other objections to this argument, such as Euthyphro's dilemma. It's a moral dilemma. But this has been addressed in my book, and I suggest you go to the relevant chapter to see how that dilemma has been addressed. So just to conclude, if objective moral truths and values exist, God must exist. If God doesn't exist, objective moral values and truths do not exist. But since they do exist, then God exists.